I never expected my reflection to frighten me more than the angry words of strangers, yet that's where my story begins, staring at a mirror in my dimly lit room, gripping the edges of the sink so tightly that my knuckles burned white. It wasn't the reflection itself that scared me, but the possibility hidden behind it, the faint whisper that maybe I wasn't who I'd spent years pretending to be. I remember thinking, if anyone knew what I felt in that moment, they'd laugh, or worse, look at me with that blend of pity and disgust I'd seen before. But there I was, a boy on paper, trembling with the suspicion that my truth was something softer, more delicate, and infinitely harder to admit. My heart pounded as though it wanted to rip out of my chest, as though it was impatient with me for dragging my feet all these years. I leaned closer to the mirror, studying the angles of my face, trying to imagine how different it could look with just a hint of eyeliner, a curl of hair, a new curve born out of fabric instead of bone. The thought sent a flush of shame through me, quickly followed by a dangerous spark of exhilaration. Shame and hope often walked hand in hand inside me, inseparable companions that made me both dread and crave what might happen if I dared to step beyond the boy everyone thought I was. I had always been careful. Always the one who smiled when people joked, who shrugged off slurs tossed casually in the locker room, who lowered his voice to sound just deep enough to blend in. But that night, something cracked. I could almost feel it, like a fragile shell splitting open, letting through just enough light to blind me with what-ifs. Could I really live this way forever, hiding, swallowing down the ache in my chest every time I saw a girl laugh freely in a dress, unaware of the envy their ease carved into me? Or was I meant to shatter everything I thought I knew about myself, even if it meant facing the sharp edge of the world's hatred? My phone buzzed on the counter, snapping me out of the trance. A message from a friend. "You okay? You were quiet today." The words made me smile bitterly. Quiet was safe. Quiet meant nobody asked questions. Quiet meant I didn't risk exposure. Yet silence was beginning to feel like its own kind of violence, like I was suffocating under the weight of my unspoken truth. I typed out a quick lie, "Yeah, just tired," and set the phone down, my reflection watching me like it knew I was running out of time to keep lying. I opened my drawer and pulled out the one thing I had dared to keep, hidden beneath layers of old homework and tangled cords, a silk scarf. It was nothing extraordinary, but when I pressed it against my skin, the softness felt like a promise I wasn't sure I deserved. My throat tightened, and I whispered words I'd never said out loud. "What if this is me?" The sound was shaky, almost fragile, but it was real. I don't know how long I stood there, caught between terror and wonder, but I know that was the night everything began to change. Not with a grand decision or a dramatic declaration, but with a quiet, trembling question whispered to the mirror. And once asked, it refused to be silenced. The days that followed carried an almost unbearable weight, like I was walking around with a secret burning a hole through my chest. Every ordinary moment, passing by classmates in the hallway, grabbing a coffee at the corner shop, laughing at a joke I didn't find funny, felt sharpened by the knowledge that I was pretending. The scarf was folded neatly back in its drawer, but it haunted me like a ghost, its softness still lingering on my skin, as if reminding me that I couldn't keep pushing this truth away forever. And yet, the fear never left. At school, I heard it in the careless way people threw around words like freak or weirdo, as if those labels were harmless until they landed on someone's heart. I tried to imagine myself walking into that world with makeup, with hair brushing my shoulders, with clothes that shaped me into the girl I felt inside. The fantasy filled me with warmth for a fleeting second, until reality crashed in and I pictured the stares, the whispers, the laughter that would sting sharper than any blade. Still, something in me was stirring. One night, when I thought my parents had gone to bed, I stood in front of the mirror again. I slipped the scarf around my shoulders, letting it drape like a makeshift shawl. I tilted my head, softened my gaze, and for a second I caught a glimpse, not of the boy who was expected, but of someone fragile, hopeful, and strangely beautiful. My breath caught in my throat, tears pricking at the edges of my eyes, because for that moment I wasn't imagining. I was becoming. But the spell shattered the instant I heard footsteps in the hallway. My body froze, heart slamming against my ribs as though it wanted to leap out and run. I yanked the scarf off, shoved it back into the drawer, and scrambled into bed just as the door creaked open. My mother peeked in, smiling faintly. "Still awake?" she asked. I forced a yawn, pretending to be half asleep. She closed the door quietly, but my body remained rigid long after she left. That night, I didn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the risk of being caught, the humiliation if someone discovered what I was doing. And yet, beneath all the fear, another thought kept echoing louder and louder. If I never tried, if I never let her, the real me, breathe, then I would spend the rest of my life suffocating under someone else's skin. By morning, I made a decision that terrified me more than anything. I would stop hiding from myself. I didn't know what that would look like yet, or how I could ever explain it to anyone, but I knew I couldn't keep erasing myself just to make others comfortable. The boy in the mirror was no longer enough. And though the world outside still looked the same, gray sidewalks, hurried faces, voices that cut too easily, I felt something small and unshakable begin to bloom inside me. A spark of defiance, a whisper of courage, the faint outline of a girl waiting to step into the light. The first time I dared to buy something meant for her, the girl inside me, was nothing short of terrifying. I walked into a small thrift shop on the far side of town, where I hoped no one would recognize me. My palms were damp, my throat dry, every step feeling like I was trespassing in a place I didn't belong. I drifted through aisles of clothing, pretending to be distracted, pretending to browse without purpose, though my heart hammered wildly as my eyes caught on the racks of dresses. I kept telling myself I was only looking, just curious, just passing by. But then my fingers brushed against a simple navy blue dress, and my chest tightened. It wasn't flashy, not glamorous, but something about its softness and quiet elegance drew me in. I glanced around nervously. No one was paying attention. My hand trembled as I slipped it off the rack and held it against me, as if measuring a secret I wasn't ready to admit out loud. The cashier barely looked at me when I paid, but I felt the heat crawling up my neck, convinced she knew, convinced she saw right through me. The walk home was a blur of paranoia. Every passing car, every glance from a stranger made me feel exposed, as though the little plastic bag in my hand was a spotlight giving away everything I'd tried so hard to hide. By the time I got back to my room, I locked the door and leaned against it, gasping with relief, the bag clutched to my chest like contraband. When I finally pulled the dress out and laid it on my bed, I just stared at it for a long time. My reflection in the mirror seemed to wait, almost daring me to cross that invisible line. My hands shook as I slipped it over my head. The fabric was cool at first, then warm as it settled against my skin. I smoothed it down, adjusted the shoulders, and looked up. The sight stopped me cold. For the first time, I didn't see only the boy I'd been forced to be. I saw her, shy, awkward, unpolished, but undeniably there. My breath caught, and my eyes stung with tears. I twirled slightly, the hem brushing against my legs, and a laugh escaped me, a sound I hadn't made in years. It wasn't mocking, wasn't forced. It was genuine joy bubbling up from a place I'd long thought was dead. But the joy was fragile. It cracked under the weight of doubt pressing in, the voice in my head whispering, "What if someone sees? What if they hate you? What if you ruin everything by being yourself?" My smile faltered. I clutched the fabric tightly, torn between the bliss of finally seeing her and the terror of letting the world see her too. That night, I didn't sleep again. The dress lay beside me on the bed, and I kept touching it as though afraid it would vanish. My mind spiraled with questions I couldn't answer, fears I couldn't silence, and yet underneath it all there was one undeniable truth. I could never go back to pretending I didn't want this. The girl inside me was no longer just a whisper. She had a face now, a laugh, a fragile but undeniable presence. And once seen, she could never be unseen. I didn't mean for anyone to find out so soon, but secrets have a way of slipping through cracks no matter how tightly you try to seal them. A week after bringing home the dress, my best friend, Daniel, came over unannounced. He'd done it 100 times before, barging into my room with his usual grin, but this time was different. I hadn't hidden the dress well enough. It was hanging on the back of my chair, plain as day. My stomach plummeted when I saw his eyes land on it. For a moment, he said nothing, his grin faltering just enough for silence to stretch like a blade between us. I scrambled to come up with an excuse, something about a cousin, a prank, anything, but the words tangled in my throat. You, got a girlfriend? He asked finally, his tone too casual, too forced. My chest tightened. This was it, the crossroads. I could lie and bury it all again, or I could take the risk that had been haunting me every night since I first slipped the dress on. My mouth went dry, but my voice came out softer than I expected. It's mine. The air shifted instantly. Daniel's eyebrows knit together, confusion flashing in his eyes, but there wasn't immediate laughter. No cruel joke. Just silence heavy enough to make my hands shake. Yours, he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. I nodded, staring at the floor. I don't know how to explain it. I just feel more like me when I wear it. My heart pounded with each word, waiting for the fallout, waiting for rejection. The pause that followed was the longest of my life. Then Daniel let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. Man, I don't really get it. But he hesitated, then added, You're still you, right? Same person I've known since forever. I dared to glance up. His face was uncertain, but not cruel. My throat tightened with relief, so sharp it almost hurt. Yeah, I whispered. Still me. Then he shrugged, a half-smile tugging at his lips. I guess it's not my job to tell you who you are. Just don't expect me to wear a dress too, okay? A shaky laugh burst out of me, half from nerves, half from gratitude. It wasn't perfect acceptance, not the fairy tale reaction I might have wished for, but it wasn't rejection either. It was enough, a bridge instead of a wall. After he left, I sat on my bed, holding the dress close. My secret wasn't entirely mine anymore, and that terrified me. But it also felt lighter somehow, like sharing it had cracked open the door just a little wider. That night, as I lay staring at the ceiling, one thought kept circling in my head. If even one person could see me and not turn away, maybe, just maybe, there was hope that the world wouldn't completely destroy me for being her. Hope is a dangerous thing. It can lift you high enough to see a new world, but also make the fall hurt even more when fear drags you back down. After Daniel saw the dress, I felt both braver and more exposed. Every glance from strangers on the street felt sharper. Every word from classmates seemed loaded with unspoken suspicion, as if my secret was leaking out of me without permission. But I also couldn't stop. The girl inside me, once timid and hidden, was becoming restless. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd slip into the dress and whisper little affirmations to myself, testing names I might someday claim, practicing a softer voice that felt strangely natural. The mirror became both my enemy and my salvation, harsh in its honesty, but also the only place where I could see her come alive. One evening, Daniel texted me, "Wanna hang out? Just us." My first instinct was panic. Did he want to talk more about what he saw? Was this the moment he'd confess he was uncomfortable with me now? Still, I agreed, because I couldn't stand the suspense of not knowing. We sat by the river, the same spot we'd been going to since we were kids. He skipped a stone across the water, then glanced at me. "So," he said carefully, "you've been doing this for a while?" I hesitated. The truth was messy, but I owed him that much. Not really. Just feeling it for a long time. I only started letting it out recently. He nodded slowly. I don't get everything about it. But you looked happy when you said it was yours. Happier than I've seen you in a while. His words caught me off guard, stirring something tender inside me. I hadn't realized anyone had noticed how heavy I'd been carrying myself. "Thanks," I murmured, my voice breaking slightly. Daniel leaned back on his elbows, staring up at the fading sky. "People might be jerks about it, you know." "I know," I whispered. The fear of that truth pressed against me daily. But he turned his head, meeting my eyes. "If this is really you, then I'd rather see you happy as you than miserable pretending, even if people don't understand." My chest tightened, tears blurring my vision. I blinked hard, not wanting to cry in front of him, but the gratitude was overwhelming. For the first time, I felt seen, not perfectly, not without confusion, but seen enough to believe I wasn't completely alone. That night, I walked home lighter. The world was still dangerous, still full of potential cruelty, but there was also a thread of kindness woven through it now, a thread I could hold onto when the shadows grew too heavy. And for the first time, the thought of showing her, the girl I was becoming, to more than just the mirror didn't feel entirely impossible. The idea of showing her, the girl inside me, to the world was both intoxicating and terrifying. I rehearsed it in my mind 1,000 times, imagining different scenarios, different reactions. Sometimes, in my fantasies, people smiled warmly, telling me I was brave. Other times, they turned away, their eyes filled with disgust. The truth was, I had no idea which version of the world would greet me, and that uncertainty gnawed at me more than anything. It started small. I bought a tube of lip gloss hidden among snacks and school supplies when I checked out at the store. I applied it late at night, staring at my reflection, marveling at how such a tiny detail could shift my entire sense of self. The shimmer on my lips caught the light, and for a moment, I smiled without hesitation. But then the panic would return. How quickly could I wipe it away if someone knocked on the door? How long before the secret slipped again? One Saturday, Daniel invited me to a small gathering at his cousin's house. Nothing big, he promised, just some friends, music, food. Chill. I almost said no, terrified of being around people when my skin was crawling with the need to be someone else. But then I thought about what he'd said by the river, that he'd rather see me happy as myself, and something inside me whispered that maybe this was the moment to test my courage. I didn't go all out, of course. I wasn't ready for that. But I chose a softer shirt, one with a slightly feminine cut that I'd bought in secret. I brushed my hair differently, letting it fall in a way that framed my face more delicately. And just before leaving, I swiped on the faintest bit of gloss, my heart hammering as though I'd committed a crime. When I arrived, nobody stared. Nobody pointed. The music was loud, people were laughing, and for a while I felt invisible, which was exactly what I needed. But then, as I stood in the kitchen pouring a drink, a girl I didn't know tilted her head at me. "I like your shirt," she said casually, smiling. The compliment hit me like a bolt of lightning. My face flushed, my stomach fluttered, and for the first time, I wasn't just a boy in borrowed clothes. I was being seen, even if she didn't know the full truth. "Thanks," I managed, my voice shaky but real. The rest of the night passed in a blur, but that moment lingered. A stranger had noticed something about me, and instead of tearing it down, she'd affirmed it. It was such a small kindness, yet it felt monumental. Walking home under the streetlights, I touched the edge of my shirt, replaying her words over and over. Maybe the world wasn't as black and white as I'd feared. Maybe there were people who could see me, not the mask, not the lie, but me, and respond with something other than hate. And with that fragile hope blooming in my chest, I began to wonder how much further I could step without the ground collapsing beneath me. The compliment at the party stayed with me for days. It was like a tiny ember glowing in the cold darkness of my fears, refusing to go out. Every time I replayed her voice, "I like your shirt," I felt a quiet affirmation that maybe, just maybe, the girl inside me wasn't destined to be hated by everyone. But courage isn't something you find once and keep forever. It slips, it falters, it asks to be rebuilt again and again. A week later, I stood in front of my closet, staring at the dress folded neatly on the shelf. My hands hovered over it, itching to wear it out, not just in the safety of my room, but outside, under the unforgiving light of day. The thought filled me with equal parts thrill and dread. That Saturday, Daniel texted, "Want to hit the mall?" Normally, I'd groan at the thought of crowded stores, but this time my chest tightened with possibility. Maybe if I wore the dress layered under a jacket, subtle but real, I could take that step. I hesitated until the last minute. My palms were slick with sweat as I slipped the dress on, tugged a hoodie over it, and checked myself in the mirror. To anyone else, it probably looked like an ordinary outfit. But to me, it was a declaration, even if whispered. At the mall, my nerves were a raw wire. Every glance felt like scrutiny, every laugh like it might be about me. Daniel noticed my stiffness. "You okay?" he asked as we weaved through the crowd. "Yeah." I lied, though my heart was racing. We wandered into a clothing store, and that's when it happened. Daniel picked up a jacket, then glanced at me. "This would look good on you." The words were casual, tossed like any friend might say, but to me, they struck deep. He didn't say it with judgment. He didn't smirk. He just said it like it was normal. I froze, staring at him. "You think so?" My voice cracked slightly. "Yeah." He shrugged. "Why not?" I wanted to cry. Because in that moment, for the first time outside of my bedroom, someone wasn't pretending not to notice. He saw me, and instead of mocking, he offered kindness. Later that night, back in my room, I sat with the dress still on beneath my hoodie. My chest ached with conflicting emotions, fear of the world's cruelty, joy at Daniel's simple acceptance, and a gnawing longing for more. More freedom, more moments like that, more of her, of me, living without apology. But I knew the path ahead wouldn't always be so gentle. And that made me wonder, when the hate inevitably came, would I be strong enough to keep holding on to her? I should have expected the backlash. Hope has a way of making you careless, of convincing you that maybe the world isn't as cruel as it once seemed. But cruelty doesn't need much to find you. It only takes a crack in the armor, a slip too visible. It happened at school. I'd worn a softer sweater, one I'd bought secretly at the thrift shop. To most people, it probably looked ordinary. But to the wrong pair of eyes, it was enough. "Nice girl's shirt," someone sneered behind me in the hallway. The words cut sharp, followed by a laugh that echoed louder than the chatter of everyone else. My stomach dropped. I walked faster, keeping my head down, pretending I didn't hear, pretending I was immune. But the truth was, my heart was racing, my palms clammy, my throat closing around a dozen unspoken words. By the time I reached class, my whole body was trembling. I sat in the back, praying no one else had noticed, that it wouldn't spread, that the moment would die in the noise of the day. But whispers lingered, and even though most people probably didn't care, the fear was enough to make me shrink inside myself again. After school, I texted Daniel. "Bad day." He didn't ask questions, just showed up at my house with a bag of chips and his old video game console. He plopped down on my floor, hooked it up, and handed me a controller. "Talk or don't talk," he said, eyes fixed on the screen. "Either way, I'm here." It was such a simple gesture, but it unraveled me. I blinked fast, trying to hide the tears, but one slipped free. He noticed, of course, but he didn't press. We played in silence, the clicking of buttons filling the room like a shield. Later, when the game was paused and the silence grew heavier, I whispered, "What if everyone hates me?" Daniel set the controller down, finally looking at me. "Then screw them." His tone was firm, not cruel, but resolute. "You've spent your whole life making sure everyone else is comfortable. Maybe it's time you let yourself breathe." The words lodged deep inside me. I wanted to believe them, to let them fill the hollow parts where fear lived. But courage is never that easy. Still, sitting there with him, I felt a fragile safety, like the storm outside couldn't quite reach me. That night, as I lay in bed, the sweater draped across my chair, I knew something had shifted. Yes, the world was dangerous. Yes, hate was real. But so was kindness. So was loyalty. So was the possibility that my story wouldn't just be about pain. It could also be about love, in all the ways it surprised me. And maybe, just maybe, love would be strong enough to defy the hate waiting outside my door. I didn't realize how much courage had been stitched into that sweater until I pulled it on again a week later. The first time, it had made me shrink under mocking whispers. The second time, it felt heavier, almost like armor. My reflection looked back at me nervously, but there was also something stubborn in my eyes, as though the girl inside me was tired of hiding and willing to take another risk. At school, I braced myself for more ridicule. And yes, I caught a few glances, the kind that lingered just long enough to sting. But not everyone looked at me like that. A girl in my history class leaned over at the end of the period and said quietly, "That color looks good on you." It was almost the same tone as the compliment at the party, casual, offhand, not exaggerated. Yet to me, it was a lifeline. I wanted to ask her what she meant if she really saw me, but my voice failed. All I managed was a shaky smile, which she returned before slipping her notebook into her bag. It was such a fleeting moment, yet it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. The rest of the day passed without disaster, and when I walked home, I felt taller, as though surviving small risks was teaching me something about strength. But when I got home, my mother's voice cut through the fragile confidence I'd built. "Where did you get that sweater?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp as they flicked over me. My breath caught. I hadn't prepared for this. Not with her, not yet. "Oh, thrift shop," I mumbled, trying to sound nonchalant. She raised an eyebrow. "It looks different. Not your usual style." Panic flared. Was she suspicious? Was she judging? My mind scrambled for excuses, but none of them felt convincing. Finally, I forced a shrug. Just wanted to try something new. Her gaze lingered, assessing, and for a moment I thought she might press further. But then she simply nodded and turned back to her cooking. My body sagged with relief, but inside, guilt gnawed at me. I hated lying, hated hiding, but the thought of telling her the truth felt like stepping off a cliff with no guarantee of landing. That night, I sat with Daniel again, telling him about both the compliment and my mother's suspicion. He listened quietly, then said, "You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just take it one step at a time. You're already braver than you think. One step at a time." The words settled over me like a blanket. I wanted to rush forward, to shed every layer of fear all at once. But maybe he was right. Maybe becoming her wasn't about one grand moment of revelation, but about dozens of small, trembling steps that eventually led me into the light. And with that thought, I held the sweater close, whispering a promise to myself. I won't give up. Not now. Not when she's finally starting to breathe. The strange thing about secrets is how they change once you start letting them out, piece by piece. At first, they feel like heavy stones pressing against your chest. But when you risk showing them just a corner, just a glimpse, they shift. They don't vanish, but they become lighter, more bearable, almost like carrying them together with someone else eases the weight. I learned this when I decided to tell the girl from my history class. Her name was Maya. She was the one who had quietly said, "That color looks good on you." I didn't know why, but her words had clung to me like a lifeline, and part of me wanted to believe she might understand. It happened after school, when we both lingered in the library. My hands were shaking as I slid into the seat across from her, heart hammering against my ribs. She looked up from her book, surprised but not unfriendly. "Hey," I said, my voice tight. Can I ask you something?" She tilted her head. "Sure." I swallowed hard. My throat felt dry, every instinct screaming at me to back out. But I forced the words through anyway. "When you said my sweater looked good on me, did you mean it?" Her brow furrowed slightly, then she smiled. "Of course I did. Why wouldn't I?" My chest ached with both relief and fear. I lowered my voice, barely above a whisper. Because it wasn't really about the sweater. My words tangled, shame surging, but I pushed forward. "I've been trying to figure out who I am. And sometimes that means clothes that aren't what people expect." The silence that followed felt suffocating. I stared at the table, ready for her to laugh, to make an excuse and leave. But instead, she said softly, "I think that's brave." My head snapped up, eyes wide. Brave. No one had ever called it that before. I'd always thought of it as shameful, weak, selfish. But in her voice, the word sounded like a shield instead of a weapon. "You really think so?" I asked, barely breathing. She nodded. "It takes courage to be honest about yourself. Most people never even try." Tears prickled at the corners of my eyes. I blinked them away quickly, not wanting to fall apart in front of her. "Thank you," I whispered. Maya's smile was gentle, but steady. If you ever want someone to talk to about it, I'm here. No judgment. That night, lying in bed, I replayed her words over and over until they melted into my dreams. Maybe Daniel was right. I didn't have to figure it all out at once. But little by little, I was finding people who saw me and didn't turn away. And for the first time, I dared to imagine a future where the girl inside me wasn't just surviving in the shadows, but living, breathing freely in a world where kindness could be louder than hate. Maya's words stayed with me like a quiet melody, playing in the background of every moment. I think that's brave. It was strange how a single sentence could alter the way I carried myself. I still felt fear, still hesitated every time I touched the hem of a dress or the tube of lip gloss hidden in my drawer, but now there was something else too. Permission. Permission to believe that what I was doing wasn't just shameful rebellion, but a step toward honesty. Days blurred into weeks, and I found myself spending more time with her. We didn't always talk about me, but whenever we did, she listened without flinching, without rushing to fill the silence with nervous jokes. She asked thoughtful questions, sometimes hard ones, but never cruel. "How's it feel when you put on something that feels right?" she asked once. I paused, searching for the right words, and finally whispered, "Like I can breathe again." Her expression softened, and she nodded as though she understood, even if she couldn't feel it herself. That was what struck me most. She didn't need to fully understand to believe me. But the world outside our small circle wasn't so kind. Rumors had started to ripple through school. They were quiet at first, whispers I caught behind my back, laughter that died the moment I turned around. I told myself I didn't care, but my body betrayed me. Shoulders hunched, steps quickened, eyes fixed on the floor. Every glance felt loaded. Every laugh felt personal. The breaking point came one afternoon when I opened my locker to find a note taped inside. 3 words, scrawled in messy handwriting. "Freak in disguise." My stomach dropped. My vision blurred. I ripped it down quickly, crumpled it in my fist, but the damage was already done. Daniel found me in the bathroom, leaning against the sink, trying to keep my breathing steady. He didn't ask what happened. He just saw the paper crushed in my hand and gently pried it open. His jaw tightened when he read it. For a second, I thought he might storm off to find whoever wrote it, but instead, he just said quietly, "Don't let them win." His words sounded strong, but all I could think was, what if they already had? That night, I sat with the dress spread across my bed. My hands hovered over it, torn between comfort and shame. Part of me wanted to shove it back into the drawer forever, to erase the reason I was being targeted. But another part, louder this time, refused. Because the truth was, the hate only proved how much this mattered. If they went out of their way to tear me down, it meant I was doing something they couldn't control, something real. And as I held the fabric close to my chest, I whispered a vow to myself. I will not let their hate erase me. The vow I whispered that night felt fragile, like glass that could shatter with one more cruel word. But sometimes fragile things are stronger than they look because they force you to handle them with care. I woke the next morning still trembling, still carrying the echo of that hateful note, yet I also carried the quiet promise I'd made to myself. And that was enough to get me out of bed. At school, I kept my head high, even when I heard the laughter ripple in the hallway. I clutched my books tighter, repeated Daniel's words, "Don't let them win," like a mantra. But it wasn't easy. Every step felt like walking barefoot on broken glass. Maya noticed, of course. She caught me outside the library, her brows knit with concern. "Rough day?" she asked softly. I almost brushed it off, almost told her I was fine. But her eyes were steady, waiting, and I found myself blurting the truth. Someone left a note in my locker. I couldn't bring myself to repeat the words written on it. Her face hardened, her voice low but firm. Cowards. People like that only know how to hide behind paper. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "It still hurts." "I know," she said, and there was no pity in her tone, just quiet understanding. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a sticky note, and scribbled something on it. She pressed it into my hand before I could ask. When I looked down, it read, You're not a freak. You're extraordinary." The tears came before I could stop them, spilling down my cheeks as I clutched the tiny square of paper like it was gold. She didn't try to comfort me with cliches or empty promises. She just gave me something to hold on to, something that would outshine the ugliness taped to my locker. That night, I stuck her note to my mirror. Every time I looked at my reflection, whether in a dress, a sweater, or just the face I was still learning to love, I saw her words glowing back at me. Extraordinary. And slowly I began to believe them. Believing her words, extraordinary, wasn't easy. Some nights, I stared at the mirror and whispered it to myself, hoping repetition would turn it into truth. Other nights, I collapsed on my bed and wondered if the hate would always be louder than kindness. But each morning, I woke up, saw Maya's note, and found just enough strength to keep moving. The strength was tested sooner than I expected. One afternoon, as I walked home, a group of boys from school trailed behind me. Their voices carried down the street, mocking, sharp, every laugh twisting deeper into my chest. I quickened my pace, my hands clammy, the dress hidden under my jacket suddenly feeling like a target on my back. Then one of them shouted, "Hey, why don't you show us your pretty little outfit?" Laughter erupted. My throat closed, tears pricking hot in my eyes. I wanted to vanish, to sink into the pavement. But before I could spiral further, a voice cut through the noise. "Leave them alone." I turned to see Daniel standing at the corner, his expression like stone. The boys faltered, muttered something under their breath, and eventually scattered. My knees nearly gave out with relief. Daniel walked over, his jaw still tight. "You okay?" I nodded, though my body was shaking so hard I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "They're just words," I whispered, trying to convince myself. "No," he said firmly. "They're hate, and you don't deserve it." His eyes softened then. "But you're stronger than they are. Don't forget that." I swallowed hard, overwhelmed by gratitude. "Why are you always there?" I asked quietly. He shrugged, his voice low. "Because you've always been there for me. And because you're you. That's enough." That night, I wrote the moment down in my journal, every word, every look, afraid I'd forget the way it felt to be defended, to be worth standing up for. Hate was real, yes, but so was loyalty. And loyalty had a way of planting roots deep enough to weather even the fiercest storms. As I drifted to sleep, I realized something important. I wasn't just surviving anymore. With Daniel's loyalty and Maya's kindness, I was slowly learning how to live as her, even when the world tried to silence me. And maybe, just maybe, there was more waiting for me than fear. Maybe there was love. Love was a word I hadn't let myself imagine for a long time. It always felt out of reach, like a language I couldn't quite speak. How could anyone love me if I couldn't even show them who I really was? But as the days went on, with Daniel's steady presence and Maya's gentle encouragement, that thought started to shift. It wasn't sudden, not a thunderclap of realization, but more like a sunrise, slow, quiet, but impossible to ignore. Maya and I started meeting in the library more often, sometimes to study, sometimes just to talk. She asked about my dreams, my fears, my favorite books, the kind of life I wanted someday. And every time I answered, I felt a little more real, a little more solid, as though speaking her name aloud pulled me further into existence. One afternoon, she surprised me by pulling a compact mirror from her bag. "Close your eyes," she said softly. My pulse raced, but I obeyed. I felt her brush against my eyelids, light and careful, and when she told me to open them, I almost didn't recognize myself. She had traced the faintest line of eyeliner, subtle but transformative. My reflection startled me. My eyes seemed brighter, softer, more alive. Tears welled instantly. I look like me?" I whispered, voice cracking. "You do," she said, smiling. "You really do." The tenderness in her voice undid me. I blinked hard, afraid to cry the makeup off, but she reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and whispered, "Don't hide from yourself anymore." It was in that moment that something shifted between us. something fragile but undeniable. The way her hand lingered, the warmth in her gaze, the soft tremor in my chest, it was more than friendship. Later that evening, as I walked home, Daniel caught up to me. He noticed the traces of eyeliner still clinging to my lashes, but instead of teasing, he smiled faintly. "She did that, didn't she?" I blushed furiously. "How do you know?" He chuckled. "You've got that look. The kind you only get when someone sees you for real." I wanted to protest, to downplay it, but the truth was too clear in my racing heartbeat. For the first time, I wasn't just hoping to be accepted. I was daring to believe I could be loved, not despite who I was becoming, but because of it. And that belief was scarier than any insult, scarier than any hateful note. Because it meant I had something precious to fight for. Love didn't arrive in a single grand gesture. It unfolded slowly, through countless small moments that stitched themselves into something undeniable. A smile held a second too long. A hand brushed against mine and lingered. A glance shared in the silence of the library, saying more than words ever could. Maya never asked me to define myself before I was ready. She just stood beside me, steady, patient, her presence like a lighthouse guiding me through storms. And Daniel, loyal, protective, sometimes awkward in his attempts to understand, remained my anchor, reminding me that not everyone would turn away when I stepped closer to the truth. But the world didn't grow gentler overnight. There were still whispers, still cruel words, still days when the weight of it all made me want to disappear. Yet now, when the hate came, it didn't feel like a wall I couldn't climb. It felt like a test I could endure, because I wasn't facing it alone. The turning point came one evening when Maya asked, "Do you ever want to be seen? Really seen, not just by me or Daniel, but by everyone?" The question terrified me. My throat tightened, my chest ached, but I nodded. "More than anything," she smiled, her eyes shining. "Then when you're ready, I'll be right there." And true to her word, she was. The first time I walked out wearing the dress, not hidden under a hoodie, not confined to the safety of my room, but fully, proudly, I thought my legs would give out beneath me. The air felt too sharp, every glance like fire. But then I felt her hand slip into mine. I looked over and saw Daniel walking a step behind, his arms crossed as though daring anyone to say something. The fear didn't vanish, but it softened, melted into something else. Defiance, yes, but also joy. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. People stared. Some whispered, but others smiled. And for the first time, I didn't lower my eyes. I held my head high, my hand in Maya's, my heart steady with the knowledge that I was finally becoming the person I'd always been. That night, when I stood before my mirror, I didn't see a stranger, or a boy pretending, or a reflection that frightened me. I saw her, the girl who had waited so long in the shadows. The girl who had survived whispers, notes, fear, and doubt. The girl who had found love in a world that tried to drown her in hate. And for the first time, I whispered to her without hesitation, "You're beautiful." The reflection smiled back, not a ghost, not a dream, but me. Fully, unapologetically me.